America tried to beat the Zero and accidentally created the Ensign Eliminator. Black screen. Low rumble of distant ocean waves. Before the Pacific War became a desperate struggle for survival, before aircraft carriers burned and entire squadrons vanished into the sea, the United States believed it already understood air combat. It believed strength would win. It believed armor meant safety. It believed experience guaranteed victory. It was wrong. Slow fade-in. Dawn over the Pacific Ocean. In early 1942, a young U.S. Navy pilot climbed into the cockpit of his aircraft as the sun rose over the endless blue. He was barely in his 20s. His flight suit still smelled new. His logbook showed just enough hours to earn his wings. He trusted the machine beneath him. He trusted the Navy that trained him. And he believed the sky was where America belonged. Then, far ahead, shapes appeared, small at first, then sharp, then unmistakable. Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. They moved differently, not heavy, not aggressive, but smooth, like birds banking on invisible currents. And in seconds, that young pilot understood something deeply unsettling. These planes were not playing by the rules he had learned. The first encounters between American pilots and the Zero were not heroic duels. They were lessons in humiliation. American pilots dove in confidently, expecting their heavier aircraft to absorb damage and overpower the enemy. Instead, the Zero slipped inside their turns, climbed above them, appeared behind them. Cut. Reenactment of dogfight. Zero turning sharply. Survivors returned shaken. Some didn't return at all. Combat reports piled up with the same language. They turned inside us. They climbed faster than anything we'd seen. We couldn't shake them. And beneath those words sat a deeper fear. Loss of control. For decades, American air doctrine had been built around power and durability. Aircraft were designed to take hits. Pilots were trained to rely on strength and firepower. The Zero shattered that philosophy. It didn't care how strong you were if you couldn't aim. Cut. Slow pan over damaged American aircraft. As Japan swept across the Pacific, Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya, the Zero became a symbol of unstoppable momentum. American pilots were not cowards. They fought, but they were fighting blind. Inside Navy command rooms, the mood darkened. This was not supposed to happen. America had the world's greatest industrial base. America had skilled pilots. America had confidence. But confidence evaporates quickly when planes stop coming home. The fear was not just about aircraft, it was about the future. If America lost control of the air, it would lose the sea. If it lost the sea, it would lose the war. So pressure mounted. Designers were summoned. Engineers were pushed. Factories were ordered to move faster. The message was simple and brutal. Beat the Zero, now. But urgency is dangerous, because urgency doesn't ask how fast, it asks how fast. Instead of fully understanding the Zero, America tried to imitate it. Lighter, more agile, more aggressive. The assumption was logical and wrong. Cut. Aircraft design sketches overlaid with Zero diagrams. The Zero was light because it sacrificed protection. No armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single hit could ignite it. Japan accepted that risk. America did not understand that trade-off, and this misunderstanding led to a fatal decision. One aircraft, never designed for frontline combat, was forced into a role it could not safely perform. Originally built as a trainer and utility plane, it was stable, forgiving, and safe. Then war arrived, and everything changed. Cut. Factory footage. Workers adding components. Guns were added. Armor was added. Fuel capacity increased. Each addition made sense in isolation. Together, they altered the aircraft's balance. Its center of gravity shifted. Its stall behavior changed. Its margin for error disappeared. On paper, the aircraft still looked acceptable. In the air, it became unforgiving, especially for inexperienced pilots. Cut. Young naval aviators laughing near aircraft. These pilots were ensigns, newly commissioned officers, men who had trained hard but lacked combat experience. They trusted the machine beneath them. They trusted the Navy that trained them. And they believed the sky was where America belonged. Then, far ahead, shapes appeared. Small at first, then sharp, then unmistakable. Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. They moved differently, not heavy, not aggressive, but smooth, like birds banking on invisible currents. And in seconds, that young pilot understood something deeply unsettling. These planes were not playing by the rules he had learned. The first accidents were dismissed: a bad landing, a pilot mistake, weather. Then more crashes followed, and then more. Stalls without warning, violent snap rolls during turns, carrier approaches that became fatal in seconds. Cut. Crash wreckage on carrier deck. Something was wrong. Pilots knew it, instructors knew it, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Then the whispers started, dark jokes in ready rooms, quiet warnings passed from one pilot to another, and finally, a name: the Ensign Eliminator. Long pause. Silence. No official report used that name. No press release acknowledged it, but among pilots it stuck, because the aircraft wasn't killing veterans, it was killing beginners. Cut. Black and white photos of young pilots. These deaths didn't happen in glorious combat. They happened during training flights, during routine operations, during moments that should have been safe, and that made them harder to accept. The Navy faced a terrible dilemma: pull the aircraft and admit a mistake during wartime, or keep it flying and hope training improved faster than casualties. They chose silence, because the Zero still ruled the sky. Cut. Carrier deck operations. This is where the story turns from engineering to psychology, because this wasn't incompetence, it was fear. Fear of falling behind, fear of losing the Pacific, fear of admitting weakness. The Zero had done more than win dogfights. It had shaken American confidence, and shaken confidence leads to rushed decisions. Cut. Zero banking gracefully. But here is the truth that would take blood and time to learn. The Zero was not superior in every way. It was fragile. It burned easily. It could not dive fast. It depended on pilots avoiding mistakes. But American pilots never got the chance to exploit those weaknesses, because they were fighting the wrong fight. America didn't need a lighter plane. It needed new tactics, new thinking, new understanding. But until that realization came, young pilots kept climbing into dangerous aircraft. Cut. Sunset over empty carrier deck. This chapter is not about blame. It is about warning, about what happens when nations rush technology without understanding the enemy, about how fear can shape machines that harm the people they're meant to protect. The Ensign Eliminator was never intended to exist. It was born from panic, and it became a lesson written in wreckage. Why the Japanese Zero shocked the world, and why America didn't see it coming. To understand why the Zero terrified American pilots, you first have to understand what the world believed about air combat before the war began. In the late 1930s, the United States did not expect to fight Japan in close, low-altitude dogfights over endless ocean. It expected a very different war. American military planners believed future air combat would be fought at high altitude, at long range, and with heavy aircraft. Bombers mattered, interceptors mattered, durability mattered. Agility, that was secondary. American fighters were built to survive. They had armor plating, they had self-sealing fuel tanks. They were designed to bring pilots home even after taking damage. This philosophy saved lives, but it came with weight. Across the ocean, Japan made a very different choice. Japanese naval planners understood something America underestimated. The Pacific was vast, carriers were far apart, islands were isolated. Range mattered more than protection. And so, Japan demanded a fighter that could fly farther than anything else in the world. Mitsubishi engineers responded with something radical. They stripped weight wherever possible. Armor? Removed. Fuel tank protection? Removed. Anything that didn't make the plane fly farther or turn tighter was discarded. The result was the Mitsubishi A6M0, introduced in 1940. It was unlike anything the world had seen. The Zero could fly over 1,600 miles with drop tanks. It could outturn nearly every fighter in existence. It climbed faster than most opponents. And in the hands of experienced Japanese pilots, many of whom had already fought in China, it was lethal. Japanese doctrine was built entirely around this aircraft. Pilots were trained to exploit maneuverability. They were taught to fight close, slow, and aggressive. They accepted fragility as the price of dominance. If they were hit, they died, but if they weren't hit, they controlled the sky. America did not understand this mindset. Before Pearl Harbor, many American analysts dismissed Japanese aircraft as inferior copies of Western designs. Racist assumptions played a role. So did arrogance. Japan was not expected to innovate. That assumption would prove catastrophic. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, the Zero announced itself violently. American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Pilots barely had time to react, and those who did were shocked by what they encountered. Within weeks, American pilots were meeting the Zero across the Pacific. The results were brutal. In the Philippines, U.S. Army Air Forces were devastated. In the skies over Wake Island, Zeros outmaneuvered everything they faced. American pilots tried to fight the way they had trained. They turned. They stayed in the fight. They lost. The Zero thrived in turning battles. The tighter the fight became, the stronger it grew. American fighters like the F-4 Wildcat were heavier and slower to respond. Once trapped in a turning fight, escape was nearly impossible. And this is where panic began to grow, because the Zero wasn't just winning, it was embarrassing American aviation. Pilots who survived reported the same thing again and again. We couldn't do anything. They were always inside our turn. They controlled the fight. These reports raced up the chain of command, and at every level they were misunderstood. American planners believed the solution was performance, more speed, more agility, more maneuverability. They did not yet realize the real solution was tactics. Instead of asking how to fight the Zero, America asked how to match it. That distinction mattered. Within weeks, American pilots were meeting the Zero across the Pacific. The results were brutal. In the Philippines, U.S. Army Air Forces were devastated. In the skies over Wake Island, Zeros outmaneuvered everything they faced. American pilots tried to fight the way they had trained. They turned. They stayed in the fight. They lost. The Zero thrived in turning battles. The tighter the fight became, the stronger it grew. American fighters like the F-4 Wildcat were heavier and slower to respond. Once trapped in a turning fight, escape was nearly impossible. And this is where panic began to grow, because the Zero wasn't just winning, it was embarrassing American aviation. Pilots who survived reported the same thing again and again. We couldn't do anything. They were always inside our turn. They controlled the fight. These reports raced up the chain of command, and at every level they were misunderstood. American planners believed the solution was performance, more speed, more agility, more maneuverability. They did not yet realize the real solution was tactics. Instead of asking how to fight the Zero, America asked how to match it. That distinction mattered. Within weeks, American pilots were meeting the Zero across the Pacific. The results were brutal. In the Philippines, U.S. Army Air Forces were devastated. In the skies over Wake Island, Zeros outmaneuvered everything they faced. American pilots tried to fight the way they had trained. They turned. They stayed in the fight. They lost. The Zero thrived in turning battles. The tighter the fight became, the stronger it grew. American fighters like the F-4 Wildcat were heavier and slower to respond. Once trapped in a turning fight, escape was nearly impossible. And this is where panic began to grow, because the Zero wasn't just winning, it was embarrassing American aviation. Pilots who survived reported the same thing again and again. We couldn't do anything. They were always inside our turn. They controlled the fight. These reports raced up the chain of command, and at every level they were misunderstood. American planners believed the solution was performance, more speed, more agility, more maneuverability. They did not yet realize the real solution was tactics. Instead of asking how to fight the Zero, America asked how to match it. That distinction mattered. Within weeks, American pilots were meeting the Zero across the Pacific. The results were brutal. In the Philippines, U.S. Army Air Forces were devastated. In the skies over Wake Island, Zeros outmaneuvered everything they faced. American pilots tried to fight the way they had trained. They turned. They stayed in the fight. They lost. The Zero thrived in turning battles. The tighter the fight became, the stronger it grew. American fighters like the F-4 Wildcat were heavier and slower to respond. Once trapped in a turning fight, escape was nearly impossible. And this is where panic began to grow, because the Zero wasn't just winning, it was embarrassing American aviation. Pilots who survived reported the same thing again and again. We couldn't do anything. They were always inside our turn. They controlled the fight. These reports raced up the chain of command, and at every level they were misunderstood. American planners believed the solution was performance, more speed, more agility, more maneuverability. They did not yet realize the real solution was tactics. Instead of asking how to fight the Zero, America asked how to match it. That distinction mattered. Within weeks, American pilots were meeting the Zero across the Pacific. The results were brutal. In the Philippines, U.S. Army Air Forces were devastated. In the skies over Wake Island, Zeros outmaneuvered everything they faced. American pilots tried to fight the way they had trained. They turned. They stayed in the fight. They lost. The Zero thrived in turning battles. The tighter the fight became, the stronger it grew. American fighters like the F-4 Wildcat were heavier and slower to respond. Once trapped in a turning fight, escape was nearly impossible. And this is where panic began to grow, because the Zero wasn't just winning, it was embarrassing American aviation. Pilots who survived reported the same thing again and again. We couldn't do anything. They were always inside our turn. They controlled the fight. These reports raced up the chain of command, and at every level they were misunderstood. American planners believed the solution was performance, more speed, more agility, more maneuverability. They did not yet realize the real solution was tactics. Instead of asking how to fight the Zero, America asked how to match it. That distinction mattered. Within weeks, American pilots were meeting the Zero across the Pacific. The results were brutal. In the Philippines, U.S. Army Air Forces were devastated. In the skies over Wake Island, Zeros outmaneuvered everything they faced. American pilots tried to fight the way they had trained. They turned. They stayed in the fight. They lost. The Zero thrived in turning battles. The tighter the fight became, the stronger it grew. American fighters like the F-4 Wildcat were heavier and slower to respond. Once trapped in a turning fight, escape was nearly impossible. And this is where panic began to grow, because the Zero wasn't just winning, it was embarrassing American aviation. Pilots who survived reported the same thing again and again. We couldn't do anything. They were always inside our turn. They controlled the fight. These reports raced up the chain of command, and at every level they were misunderstood. American planners believed the solution was performance, more speed. When America's answer to the Zero became a nightmare in the sky. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific War had entered its most unforgiving phase. This was no longer a war of surprise attacks and early victories. It was a war of attrition, exhaustion, and brutal learning. And in the air, the learning curve was steep and deadly. American pilots were encountering the Mitsubishi A6M0 almost daily now, over Guadalcanal, over the Coral Sea, over endless stretches of open ocean where rescue was unlikely and mistakes were fatal. Every engagement followed a familiar pattern. The Zero turned tighter. The Zero climbed faster. The Zero stayed inside the American fighter's circle, and then the American plane went down. The reports flooding back to command were disturbing. Pilots described an enemy aircraft that seemed to defy physics. One moment it was above them, the next on their tail. No matter how hard they pulled, the Zero stayed with them. Morale began to crack. In briefing rooms and ready rooms, pilots whispered the same question. How do we fight something that can always outturn us? Commanders needed an answer, fast, and that desperation shaped what came next. America did not yet understand that it didn't need to outturn the Zero. Instead, it tried to match it. That decision would cost lives. At the same time as combat losses mounted, another crisis was unfolding, one far from enemy fire. Training. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were expanding at an unprecedented rate. Thousands of young men were being rushed through flight school. Hours were cut, syllabi compressed, experience replaced with urgency. These were not reckless pilots. They were simply new, and new pilots need forgiving aircraft. Instead, they were handed planes that demanded perfection. One particular aircraft, rushed into roles it was never meant to fill, quickly developed a dark reputation. On paper, it looked like a solution. It was faster than older fighters. It had more firepower. It was supposed to help close the gap against the Zero. But paper does not fly. In the air, the aircraft behaved strangely. Pilots noticed it felt unstable at low speeds. Approaches required constant correction. Turns demanded more attention than expected. Experienced aviators compensated instinctively. Young pilots didn't yet have that instinct. The first fatal accidents occurred during routine operations. A stall during a carrier landing, a sudden roll during a tight turn, a nose that dropped without warning. No enemy involved, no heroic last stand, just silence. Investigations followed, and each time the conclusion was the same: pilot error. That explanation was comforting. It preserved confidence in the aircraft, it avoided delays, it kept production moving. But it was wrong. As weeks passed, the accidents increased, not dramatically at first, just enough to worry those paying attention. Squadron commanders began to notice patterns. The same conditions, the same maneuvers, the same deadly outcome. Almost always the victims were junior officers, ensigns. The nickname spread slowly. At first it was whispered, never in official settings. Then it appeared scribbled on chalkboards. Eventually, everyone knew it, the Ensign Eliminator. It wasn't meant to be cruel, it was meant to be honest. Meanwhile, combat continued to expose the aircraft's limitations. Against the Zero, it struggled. The additional armor and weapons, added in an attempt to improve survivability, had shifted the aircraft's center of gravity. This made it less stable, less forgiving, less predictable. In turning fights, it bled energy quickly. In low-speed maneuvers, it flirted with disaster. And inexperienced pilots, trained under peacetime assumptions, often didn't recognize the warning signs until it was too late. Some pilots tried to fight the Zero head-on, others tried to turn with it. Both approaches ended the same way: a flash of tracers, a burst of flame, or a sudden loss of control. Yet the aircraft stayed in service. Why? Because the alternative was worse. America could not afford empty flight decks. Commanders faced impossible choices: ground the aircraft and leave ships exposed, or fly it and accept the losses. Most chose to fly, and so the deaths continued, quietly, relentlessly. Not all pilots were blind to the truth. Some survived long enough to learn. They noticed that the Zero struggled in high-speed dives, that it burned easily when hit, that it couldn't absorb punishment. These pilots adapted. They avoided turning fights, they attacked from altitude, they struck once, then disengaged. They lived. But survival-based knowledge spread slowly in war. Training manuals lag behind reality. Doctrine takes time. Lives are spent in the meantime. The tragedy was not that America lacked courage or skill, it was that it misunderstood the problem. The Zero wasn't unbeatable, but it required a different way of thinking. Instead of changing thinking first, America changed metal, and that metal betrayed the men flying it. By late 1942, the evidence was overwhelming. Accident rates were unacceptable, combat performance was disappointing, confidence was eroding. Quietly, without fanfare, the aircraft was reassigned, removed from front-line duty, phased out of roles it was never meant to perform. No announcements, no apologies, just absence. For the families of the lost, there was no explanation, just telegrams, just silence. But something important had happened. America had begun to learn, not from victory, but from failure. The Zero had not won because it was perfect. It won because America fought it the wrong way. And the cost of learning that truth was paid in blood.
The captured Zero that shattered America's assumptions and exposed a deadly illusion. For nearly a year, the Mitsubishi Zero had existed as a nightmare rather than a machine. American pilots didn't talk about it like an airplane, they talked about it like a force of nature, something that appeared without warning, something that could not be escaped, something that punished every mistake instantly. The Zero was faster in the turn, tighter in the climb, always inside your circle. And worst of all, no one knew why. Every report sounded the same. It outturned us. It stayed on my tail. I couldn't shake it. But none of those reports explained the truth. They only described the fear. Because fear grows strongest in the absence of understanding. And for months, America had been fighting blind. Cut. Montage of dogfights fading into darkness. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps believed the Zero was technologically superior. They believed Japanese engineers had discovered something America hadn't. They believed the answer was better performance, more agility, tighter turns, lighter aircraft. And in chasing that belief, America made mistakes, deadly ones. What no one realized yet was this: the Zero was not powerful because it was advanced, it was powerful because it was specialized, and specialization always comes with a cost. That cost would finally be revealed, not through victory, but through accident. Cut. Slow zoom on Aleutian Islands map. In June 1942, while the world watched Midway, Japan launched a secondary operation in the Aleutian Islands near Alaska. It was a forgotten front, cold, remote, almost irrelevant. And yet, this is where the entire air war changed. Japanese pilot Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga was flying a Zero when ground fire struck his aircraft. The damage was not immediately fatal, but it was serious. Oil pressure dropped, the engine began to falter, time ran out. Koga knew one thing: he could not make it back to base. He needed to land. Now. Cut. Through thick fog and uneven terrain, Koga spotted what looked like a flat surface on Akutan Island. From the air, it appeared solid, firm, safe. It was none of those things. Cut. Slow motion reenactment. The surface was soft tundra. As the Zero touched down, its landing gear dug in violently. The aircraft flipped end over end. Metal screamed, glass shattered. The impact killed Koga instantly. But the Zero did not disintegrate. It lay there, damaged, inverted, but largely intact, silent, waiting. Cut. Dramatic reveal of crashed Zero. When American patrols found the wreck days later, they were stunned. They expected debris. Instead, they found a prize, the enemy's greatest weapon, captured, whole. This had never happened before. Every Zero encountered until now had been destroyed or lost at sea, never recovered, never examined, never understood. The wreck was guarded like gold, covered, disassembled piece by piece, and shipped under extreme secrecy to the United States. No press, no celebration, only urgency. Cut. Inside American hangars, engineers, intelligence officers, and test pilots gathered. This was not curiosity. This was desperation. They believed they were about to uncover revolutionary engineering, something that explained months of defeat. What they discovered instead was devastating. The Zero was astonishingly light, not elegant, not advanced, light. Cut. Structural cross-sections. There was no armor protecting the pilot, none. No steel plate behind the seat, no bullet-resistant glass. If a round hit the cockpit, the pilot died immediately. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A single tracer round could ignite the aircraft. Fire spread instantly. There was no protection, no margin. American engineers were horrified. This aircraft did not protect its pilot, it sacrificed him. The Zero had been built around a brutal philosophy: victory at any cost, even the pilot's life. But the revelations didn't stop there. The aircraft structure was examined closely. Thin wing spars, minimal reinforcement, everything optimized for one thing only: agility. Then came the test flights. American pilots flew the Zero under conditions Japanese doctrine avoided: high-speed dives, aggressive pullouts, sustained stress. Cut. Test flight reenactment. And the Zero began to reveal its fear. At higher speeds, the controls stiffened dramatically. The aircraft resisted pilot input. Dive too fast and recovery became dangerous. Push too hard and the wings threatened to fail. This was the truth hidden behind the myth. The Zero could not chase diving aircraft. It could not sustain high-speed engagements. It survived only when the fight stayed slow, tight, and controlled. Suddenly, every combat report made sense: why Zeros avoided dives, why they disengaged instead of pursuing, why they lured enemies into turns. It wasn't dominance, it was survival. This realization struck American leadership like a physical blow, because it meant something unbearable. America had not been losing because its aircraft were inferior.
America had been losing because it was fighting the wrong fight. American fighters could dive faster, they could absorb punishment, they could survive hits the Zero never could. But pilots had been trained incorrectly. Cut. Training manuals flipping. They had been taught to dogfight, to turn, to stay engaged. Against the Zero, that training was lethal. Once the truth emerged, doctrine changed fast, painfully fast. Briefings became blunt. Do not turn with the Zero. Maintain speed at all times. Attack from altitude. Fire once. Disengage. No ego. No heroics. Only survival. Cut. Tactical animations shift. The thatch weave became standard practice. 2 aircraft covering each other. When a Zero followed one, it flew directly into the guns of the other. Teamwork replaced individual duels, and the results were immediate. Zeros tried to follow diving Americans. They couldn't. They fell behind. They broke apart. They burned. Cut. Dramatic combat montage. Loss ratios shifted. Confidence returned. The Zero was still dangerous, but no longer mystical. Once a weapon loses its myth, it loses its power. And now comes the most painful irony of all. The aircraft that had earned the nickname Ensign Eliminator had never been the real enemy. Young pilots had died not because the plane was evil, but because they were asked to fight a myth without knowledge. Once doctrine changed, training accidents dropped, survivability increased, aircraft were flown a way they were meant to be flown. The lesson was brutal, and it was paid in lives. Cut. Empty bunks, folded flags, carrier deck at sunset. America had tried to copy what it thought made the Zero strong: agility, lightness, turning ability. But it had ignored the price Japan paid for that strength, a price measured in dead pilots. Once America understood that price, it refused to pay it. The captured Zero did not win battles, it saved lives by killing an illusion.
The war America won, the pilots it lost, and the lesson written in blood. History remembers victories. It remembers flags raised, islands captured, enemies defeated. It remembers the aircraft that won battles, the generals who planned campaigns, the moments that look good in textbooks. But history almost never pauses for the empty spaces, the quiet spaces, the places where something or someone should have been and wasn't. World War II in the Pacific is often told as a comeback story. America is surprised. America stumbles. America adapts. America wins. That arc is clean, comforting, but it hides something uncomfortable. Because before adaptation comes confusion, and before victory comes cost. The Mitsubishi Zero did more than shoot down American planes. It shook American confidence. It broke assumptions that had been treated as facts for decades. Before the war, American aviation doctrine believed in balance. Speed mattered, but so did armor. Firepower mattered, but so did survivability. Pilots were assets, not expendable tools. The Zero rejected that balance entirely. It chose extremes: maximum range, maximum maneuverability, minimum protection. It was a gamble, and in the early months of the war, that gamble paid off. American pilots encountered something they were not trained to face: a fighter that demanded they fight on its terms, a fighter that punished every instinct they had learned. And when fear enters a system, clarity leaves it. Instead of asking why the Zero was winning, America asked how to copy it. That distinction matters. Designers were pressured to make aircraft more agile. Commanders demanded solutions immediately.
There was no time for slow learning. Ships were at risk, men were dying, and in that pressure, America rushed. Aircraft that were never meant for frontline combat were pushed forward. Training timelines were shortened. Young pilots were expected to perform miracles with machines they barely understood. This is where the story becomes tragic, because the enemy did not kill some of these pilots, their own aircraft did. Training flights ended in splashes instead of landings. Approaches that should have been routine became fatal. Stalls happened without warning. Recovery was impossible. Officially, these were labeled pilot error. Unofficially, the truth was darker. The aircraft were unforgiving, and the pilots were inexperienced. The Ensign Eliminator nickname was not cruel, it was honest. It was a way for pilots to acknowledge what leadership would not, that something was wrong. These were not reckless men. They were disciplined. They followed orders. They trusted the system. And the system failed them. This is the part of war that rarely gets discussed, because it forces us to admit something painful. Not all wartime deaths are caused by the enemy. Some are caused by fear, some by haste, some by the refusal to slow down and learn. When the captured Zero was finally examined, the illusion shattered. The aircraft that had seemed unbeatable was revealed to be fragile, terrifyingly fragile. No armor behind the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, thin structural components designed for one thing only: agility. The Zero did not forgive mistakes, it demanded perfection. Japan had built a weapon that assumed its pilots would die if hit, and early in the war, Japan accepted that cost. America did not want that kind of war, but for a brief moment, in its desperation, it almost stumbled into it. Once American test pilots flew the Zero, the truth became unavoidable. The Zero was not dominant everywhere. It was dominant only where it wanted to fight. At low speed, it was king. At high speed, it was helpless. In dives, it could not follow. Under sustained fire, it burned. This revelation changed everything. Doctrine shifted. Training changed. Briefings became brutally clear. Do not turn with the Zero. Maintain speed. Attack from altitude. Disengage immediately. No more heroics, no more duels, only survival. And suddenly, American pilots began to live. Loss ratios flipped, confidence returned, the Zero's myth died, but victory did not erase the cost. Because the pilots lost before this understanding arrived did not come back. They were buried quietly, their deaths folded into statistics, their lessons learned too late to save them. This is the true legacy of the Ensign Eliminator, not the aircraft, not the nickname, but the warning it represents. A warning about what happens when organizations chase appearances instead of understanding. America did not lose those pilots because it was weak. It lost them because it tried to move faster than reality allowed. And this pattern is not unique to World War II. It repeats itself again and again. Modern militaries still chase enemy technology. They copy aircraft shapes. They copy missile ranges. They copy drone concepts. But they often fail to copy context. They fail to copy doctrine. They fail to copy the assumptions and the sacrifices behind those designs. Every weapon reflects a philosophy. Every design choice hides a trade-off. Ignore that trade-off and someone pays for it. The Zero's philosophy was simple: win now, accept losses later. America's philosophy, once it corrected itself, was different: survive, learn, adapt. That philosophy took longer to show results, but it endured. By the end of the war, Japan's pilot corps was shattered. It could not replace experience. Its specialized doctrine collapsed. America, meanwhile, grew stronger. Its pilots rotated. Its training improved. Its aircraft evolved around survivability, not perfection. That difference decided the war. But again, victory does not erase responsibility. The young ensigns who died in training were not stepping stones. They were people. They had futures, families, lives that extended far beyond a cockpit. Their absence shaped others. Squadrons remembered them. Pilots flew differently because of them. History does not list them as heroes, but history depends on them because their deaths forced uncomfortable questions, and uncomfortable questions create real change. This is why the story of the Zero matters today, not because of Japan, not because of America, but because it reveals a universal truth. Technology does not win wars. Understanding does. Speed does not save lives. Patience does. And copying an enemy without understanding their sacrifices is one of the fastest ways to repeat their mistakes. Somewhere, right now, decisions are being made under pressure. Systems are being rushed. Pilots are being trained faster than doctrine can mature. And years from now, someone will look back and ask, why didn't they slow down? Why didn't they test more? Why didn't they listen to the warnings? History already knows the answer, because urgency always feels more important than understanding, until it kills someone. The pilots lost to the Ensign Eliminator never got to tell their story, but their lessons survived, and it is written clearly for anyone willing to read it. Understanding wins wars. Imitation kills. The greatest danger in war is not the enemy. It is the assumption that we already understand him.